Hello. Or as we say in Nova Scotia, g'day. G'day, bye. My name is Jim Gerrie, and I'm here to talk about a project that I began about 2.5 years ago, before the major focus on elbows up in Canada emerged, to begin trying to compile a functioning body, a composition, a compilation of early basic computer programs that I could somehow attribute some kind of Canadian connection to. In other words, a body of significant Canadian early basic computer programs. And if you're wondering what the time frame I'm thinking of is, it's from about 1977 to 1983 primarily, although I smooge beyond that and have smooched beyond that. What I want to do today, you've made the mistake of inviting an academic to come and speak. So in addition to kind of talking about some of my own hobby background that has brought me to this strange project, I'm going to try to defend why I think it's important because as a project. Because although now we are in fully elbows up mode, and it seems like trying to compile a list and body of Canadian early basic programs seems to be a kind of a amazing patriotic duty on my part that should be extolled by the Prime Minister at Davos or something like that. That's not how it started out. It seemed particularly obscure. And my reasoning for doing it arose out of my other hobby programming interests, and this was merely an extension of it, which had made me aware of a kind of representation of BASIC in the early age of computing, the histories of it, that I think is particularly to be struggled against and overcome, I think, which is the basis for why I thought we should also understand the particular Canadian contribution to early basic computer programming and its impact on the early computer revolution. So just on the screen here today, I'm going to start with my webpage that I keep of the listing that I've achieved so far that's available online via my GitHub web pages that you can find and online. And it has on it so far about 125 different programs that I feel have some kind of a pedigree of a Canadian connection, going back to in that period primarily, but also into the mid-'80s as well. And I think this variation of it, which is not directly online, only has 124. Yeah, 124. But I have structured my database for this based on some suggestions from Zbigniew Strachniak at the Computer Museum at York University for trying to describe the basic details of each one of these programs that I've found, because he has generously agreed to take my compilation and of the source code and the functioning programs, because I'm trying to find functioning programs or make them function so that people will have some ability via some means, usually emulation, potentially someday or presently, to be able to utilize these programs. Because I don't want to see them simply as dead listings in scanned magazines or in old computer type-in books, which have been my primary source of obtaining some of these, most of these programs. So that is the kind of project that I've undertaken. Who am I and where did I come from and why do I have any expertise in this? It all started with my own hobbyist. That's not good. Beginnings in the early computing revolution in the 1980s with this strange little computer here called the TRS-80 microcolor computer. The MC10 is the usual name. It's rather obscure why it's called the MC10. Nobody knows, because it has microcolor computer written on it, but in all of its major advertising and documentation from Tandy Radio Shack, it's called the MC10. But why the 10? Nobody knows. It doesn't have many major chips in it. It has a 6803 from Motorola and a VDG 6847 in it, but where's the 10? The best suggestion has been that it might be that it's 10 inches diagonally somehow. It's a small little computer because it was meant to compete with the Sinclair ZX81, I think, or the Timex Sinclair 1000 in North America, which Tandy obviously felt was going to be a much larger market segment than it ended up turning out to be. And so by the time they introduced this computer in the early 1980s, around 1983, that market had kind of passed, and computers of the Commodore 64 and Atari 800s and so forth were starting to come down in price and were taking hold in family homes, and people didn't need the ultra-low cost budget computer anymore, except flinty families like mine living in Hamilton there, where I had a father who worked in the steel plant. Mother was a teacher, but we weren't swimming in cash, and they weren't going to just hand me over a computer. I had to earn it with lawn mowing money, and I didn't want to wait because the computer revolution was unfolding, and I wanted to jump on board. I was fascinated by computers, especially computer programming, and I wanted to get right in. But I couldn't wait. I only had about just over, almost close to $100 to spend in 1983 or late 83, I think, and I couldn't afford whatever the Commodore 64s that were going at the time. I didn't want a VIC-20 because I had a snobbish kind of exposure to some of the computer languages out there, and I thought its BASIC was a little bit hobbled because of its inability to kind of handle graphics and so forth directly through the language. So I wanted something from Radio Shack, but I couldn't afford a Coco, which was up in the $200 or $300 range, and my parents weren't going to budge on it. So Tandy kind of realized the market was dead for this, and so they canceled it, and then they just started bargain binning it. I can see why here. I understand why people call these the Trash 80 now, maybe. It's still working, though, so I will say that. Well, maybe not anymore. But so this was on sale for like $80 or something like that, and I was able to afford it. I went down there against my parents' better wishes, who said I should wait, be patient, and get a better machine, and jumped in on the computer revolution. And when I first brought it home, I was completely over the moon, but then I quickly realized that because it had been an orphan machine, there was no software for it, or hardly any software. They only ever introduced about a dozen programs, all in BASIC mostly, except for one machine language game, and then that was it. That was the software body for this, and they were very simple programs because the computer came primarily as a 4K machine, about 4 or 5 pages of text. And you could put a pack on it and bump it up to 20K. And most anyone who uses these today will do that as the kind of new baseline. But most of the software was simple on 4K. So I had to program my own programs for it, and that meant going into the library at my high school and going through all the free magazines that were available for computers that had all the type-ins, and then having to go through the agonizing process of trying to convert programs from Atari Basic and Commodore Basic and Texas Instrument 99 4A Basic to try to get those programs to work on this strange little orphan machine. And I did that. I learned to program in BASIC quite intensively through that exercise of having to port every piece of software that I would ever be able to use on my machine. And of course, the schoolyard was kind of ruthless. If you had crappy computers that couldn't do anything, you were sneered at. So I was trying desperately to keep up in that race by at least being a person familiar with computer programming. But eventually I went off to university with a Tandy 1000, of course. My parents finally knuckled under and paid it out for something for me that I could use at school when I went off a few years later. But that experience came back to me when I entered into my midlife crisis. I wanted to return to a retro computing hobby, and that hobby for me was basic programming. So I went back, I found my old programs, I figured out how to pull them off of the tape cassettes that they had to be saved on. I began to work with them, improve them, and share them with others on the burgeoning internet in the early 2000s. And then I went on to start programming other computer programs, ones that I had remembered that I had somehow lost, I recreated, others that I had had in mind at the time from magazines and books that I had always wondered, could I convert this? I began to convert. And slowly I began to build a software library for the Tandy MC10. And about this time, I would say I have either ported or written original programs of at least 1,000 or so. And I have moved far beyond the Commodores and TI-99s and Ataris to explore a whole host of other computers from around the globe. Computers like those from the revolution of computing in Japan, like the NEC PC 6001, which has the same video chip or a variation of it, Japanese variation of the MC 6847 in it. And there are, as I discovered, a host of other computers that have that chip in it. It was a chip that Motorola created in the late 1970s for video display that was cheap and effective and not as sexy, of course, as the Ataris or the Commodore video chips that would come later in the late 80s and in the early 80s. Of course, but it was functional, and it therefore got stuck in a whole bunch of computers, computers that were cheap and cheery and budget in countries all across the world. So in Finland, you might use a computer called a TexEd, I think 6000 or something, that had that chip in it. In France, they would clone the MC10 for their educational program, Information pour tous, and try to, the company Matra Hachette would try to sell a variation of the MC10 called the Alice to the government for that program. Didn't succeed. It wasn't a success either. But in places like Australia, they had their Dick Smith equivalent to the Radio Shack computer system, electronic stores, systems that sold across North America. They had Dick Smith, and they created a computer called the VZ300, which had a MC6847 in it, and so on. Countries like Korea had Samsung products with that in it, and so forth. And I've discovered this now and was able to port more and more software because of these, this family of computers that all use that one chip. And that's partly what has allowed me to get up to that 1,000 programs and probably more number in BASIC, drawing upon the kind of world tradition of early BASIC computer programs. So that's my kind of background that I brought to this project, to create the type-in Canadian early BASIC programs database effectively. But there are some of my other programs, just early artificial intelligent programs from type-in books and magazines to teach the basic concepts is another database that I have created, trying to make these functional programs available to people who might be interested to see how the tiny acorns were that eventually have given rise to the AI revolution that we have today. And just text adventure programs that are highly influential in creating the new genre of what we might call, what's the word? Interactive fiction. Sorry, can never remember that. Just text adventures. So, as I said, what I'd like to do today is give a kind of an apologetic that goes beyond simple knee-jerk nationalism for why it's important for us to have some kind of exposure, ability to interact with the early basic computer programs that helped fuel the early computing revolution. So I'm just going to kind of go over some of the contributions of hobbyists and basics programmers that I think have been overlooked, radically overlooked in the histories, that I have been able to kind of become aware of through this process of this late stage hobby activity of myself over the last several decades. And to help try to contribute to the preservation of basic programs, which has been somewhat poor, and we'll talk about some very close calls and some sad losses of computer programs from the early periods of personal and home computing that BASIC played a role in, but are now gone. I'll also talk about some of my own programs that I've discovered are missing, can't be located, that I think might be of some historical significance, and some of the obstacles I've had to overcome in trying to engage in this project, and some of the mistakes that I've made. So my primary motivation, as I said, is to try to overcome a kind of narrow understanding of especially because obviously I'm very interested in computer game programs, and the focus here is going to be on computer basic games, at least, because that's where my primary interest has always lied. If you look at histories of computer video gaming, you often find a kind of a black hole when it comes to the basic computer language's contribution to that. The typical histories in general of computer gaming, of video gaming, go something like this. Pong happened, then Pac-Man happened, then Nintendo happened, then Doom happened, and then COD happened, or something like that. And so if you ever get a history of that, that's the kind of line of focus that you will typically see. If BASIC is at all mentioned, and even in some of the recent histories of the basic programming language books that have been published on that, will often not particularly emphasize its use in kind of gaming beyond, say, text adventures, some mention of it. The only major kind of reference you get to BASIC in these general histories is some kind of understanding of the impact on students' lives of the Oregon Trail educational game, right? Where everyone dies of whatever it is, syphilis, I don't know, I can't remember. Never can make it to the end. I've uncovered and got working more than a number of variations of this early computer educational BASIC program. But that was about what you would get in the standard general histories of video gaming in terms of any reference to BASIC. In Canada, it's not that much better. I mean, if you look at some histories of Canadian video gaming and programming, they go something like this, very condensed, of course. Game historians believe that Canadian game development kicked off in 1983. So it didn't start till then, with the publishing of two successful Apple II computer games, Evolution and BC's Quest for Tires. This is from Anthony Jeremiah's 2025 Centennial College History of Video Gaming website. Special subsidies in Quebec meant that Ubisoft opened a studio there in 1997, leading to other publishers like Eidos, Warner Brothers, and THQ setting up shop over time. Today, Ubisoft's local Toronto branch, which opened in 2010, is at the top of the local video gaming industry. Stat-wise, Canada's video gaming industry is ranked number 3 worldwide in terms of people employed in it. So obviously no mention of BASIC there. But what I want to argue is that if we look deeply at some very influential early BASIC games, what we see is a pattern that BASIC plays a critical role in the establishment of some very major video game genres. It's there at the beginning, but often its role is overlooked or completely obscured. The first example of that I want to look at, which I've managed to recover a copy of and get into a working BASIC program version, which you can see there in the middle, is the game Star Traders by Dave Kaufman. And he, as a university student, created a game which involved trying to trade goods and travel through space, occasionally interacting with pirates that can frustrate your attempts to move between planets, spread out in a random starscape, which you have to move intelligently between and figure out what they need and what goods are going to sell where and how and when and time it. But what was really interesting about this game, and I think is important in terms of its kind of impact, was that in some of the obscure historical records about programming, you can find people mention that this was the first game that they ever played interactively with other people. It started out as a program run on some of the first shared mini computer systems, DEC systems, and so forth. But those systems and the internet were not particularly well developed. There weren't the kind of ease of sharing data quickly across lines. It was pretty much the ARPANET, and it was like email and very simple but complicated file sharing and so forth. It was all that you could do in a kind of a text-based system. And it's not entirely clear how this game could be played interactively. It's mentioned in some of the documents by some of the people who played it or used it, but it's not clear how. So in recovering the game and getting it running again, what I came to realize is that it was probably interactive because the game saves its data file between turns, between the different players who are competing with each other to make money as the traders, right? In the same shared universe, so forth, moving around between the planets. When your turn is finished, it saves the data file and says, next player up. Now, what I figure is you could probably just then send that file to the next player. They could have the program running on their local computer system. They would bring it up and replace the data file with that one, and then they would start their turn and then repeat for whoever else was in the chain. You can have up to 8 players on the original, so forth. And that is a kind of I think it was intended that people would be playing in the same room, but it got hacked by people and so forth, and used to kind of engage in some of the first kind of cross-net computer gaming going on. And it's a BASIC program. And until I found it and got a copy running on the net, as far as I could determine, there was no other way to play this game or to kind of understand that kind of interesting fact about that game. It might not have... Oh, I got my video playing here. Gone on to my next slide. Oops, sorry. So this game eventually kind of influences the entire genre of what come to be called space trading and combat games today, which have all kinds of graphic elements to them. But they got their motivation as a genre from this first one. You quite clearly can see that the developments of this game kind of proceed from people looking at the original and saying, I could make that better by adding X, right? Including eventually visuals and so forth. So that's an important role that is often overlooked in a basic game. Okay, whoops. Another game of importance, I think. This one here is a Japanese game that I came across when I was exploring the NEC PC 6001 and its basic programs. And this is a game charmingly called Shoplifting Boy, or Manbiki Shunin. And if you look at the more obscure historical documents, it's often pointed out by a few of those contributors to be the major influence on the genre that has come to become called stealth gaming, because it involved the first use of the player with the dynamic of having to try to hide, right, and continuously hide from something that was searching for you. In this case, it's the shopkeeper moving across the top of the screen there, looking down the aisles, shaking his hands and being aggravated. Why? Because the stock from his store is slowly disappearing from the player, moving about and then hiding in the middle zones between the store shelves to reach out and strike again and steal more stuff. And the shopkeeper can't see that unless he gets you trapped in one of the aisles, and when he's at the top of the aisle, then he comes down and he grabs you, and you end up jumping up and down behind bars, being incarcerated. So this has been attributed to have influenced what is generally considered to be the founding kind of game of this genre, the Lupin 3, kind of an arcade cabinet video game by a big company, Taito. Oh, there goes the shopkeeper. He's raging mad up there. And that game, of course, is attributed as being the major influence. Does he actually go to prison? No, I didn't show that. Okay. So what that for me illustrates is kind of the theme that I want to develop here, which is that in terms of history, what happens is a kind of corporate capture of history. Right? Because they end up producing the kind of widespread, the more polished, the more intensively distributed versions of these things, they get all the glory, right? They get all of the kind of copy in the history books. But people like Dave Kaufman, just working as a university student, the person who invented Manbiki Shunin was simply a university student working in a computer club, I think, in Japan, for his own personal interests, and eventually inspires a company to try to take his idea and refine it, and so forth. Another influential not basic program, but one that I have converted to basic because for a long time it was thought to be lost, was the original text adventure called Adventure, or sometimes called Colossal Cave. Originally written by Will Crowther in Fortran, a language very similar to BASIC in a lot of ways, for microcomputer, university-like computer systems. He wrote that computer program. It eventually got shared around the kind of proto-internet and got modified in an intense way with all kinds of fantastical elements to it. But the original program was lost, right, for a very long time until it was finally uncovered from the efforts of a scholar down in the US to try to orchestrate people's attempt to try to find it again, because it had given rise to this other variation that had become much more widely known and had influenced the creation of that entire genre of text adventuring as such. So it represents for me a kind of an example of how precarious some of these materials can be. Something as important as that might have disappeared, the original version of it, before it was kind of fantasticized by subsequent authors. And the original version has some fantasy elements in it. It's kind of Peer Gynt. There is a dwarf wandering around the caves who throws knives at you. That was determined. It has some fantastical elements to it. But the other thing that shines through is that the cave that it was modeled upon was an actual cave system, the colossal cave system down in the US. And you can really see that in the earliest versions of it. But you would never be able to kind of make a clear determination of those kinds of things, whether it had some of the kind of adventure elements in it that we thought it might, until you kind of could see the game running and so forth. Another game that I've uncovered or wandered across in my porting exercises is a game called Nostromo by Akira Takaguchi, who was another Tokyo University student in 1981. And his game, which is actually called Yosusen Nostromo, Space Freighter Nostromo, is often in the more obscure corners of the historical understanding of gaming history, recognized to be a kind of a founding game for the survival horror game genre. And that connection is because in this game, you have to, and you can see in the upper part there, you have to kind of venture out from your little red safety zone on the spaceship. This is obviously playing off of the movie Alien, which is situated on the freighter Nostromo. You have to venture out to get various materials from the lockers that you can see there. And the alien is running around and trying to capture you. You can be safe in the red zone, but when you're out and not inside a locker, it can get you. Now, that's not the horror part. The horror part is, and this again can only emerge from actually having a copy of the game and being able to run it, and that is that in later levels, the alien starts to phase out every once in a while. It disappears. You know that it's running along a hall, and then all of a sudden it disappears, and you don't know what other halls it's gone down. Is it coming for you? Is it getting closer? In the hardware arcade visual presentation limits of this very early computing system, it does manage to create a kind of a creepy uncertainty about the alien that kind of recreates something of the feeling of the original movie upon which it was based. And once again, I had to try to go to some various hard lengths to get hold of the source code because the Japanese hobby computing industry is largely, field is just kind of emerging again as well as it is for the computing world in North America like today. But it is a game that was very hard to, I got my timing, hard to get a running copy of. They don't have as many highly developed repositories or emulators, at least until a few years ago when I began exploring this game. They weren't available to be able to see it and run it as easily. So I had to port it to the MC10, of course, right? And then I was able to discover these kinds of dynamics that led to its kind of horror element that some of the people recounting their experience said, yeah, this has got me thinking about horror as an element to try to create in games, right? And so it's thought to have influenced that genre, but it's often overlooked. Another influential game that also gets mentioned in histories from Japan is Cavern 2160 by Takaya Arita, who was a professor, again, at a university. And he simply submitted this game as a type-in, and some people consider it one of the first of what are nowadays called sandbox games. That is kind of open world games where you are kind of not as constrained in your movements. You're not just moving down hallways or gobbling, pre-laid out paths of munchies like in many video games. In this one, you just can go anywhere on the screen and carve holes in the kind of and patterns in the screen, right? In whichever directions you want to move. So the patterns in the upper right there are all, except for the very top line where there's just a bunch of snakes running around, back and forth, S's, right? And Other than that, what you've got to do is just try to create patterns where the snakes can kind of fall into those patterns and then begin navigating those terrains and then trap them, and then you can kill them one by one if you're intelligent in how you lay out your world, right? So that's why it's considered a bit of a sandbox game, and kind of foundational and inspirational for a lot of people, and has been ascribed as contributing to games like Dig Dug and so forth. Again, another game from Japan, Hyenkyo Alien, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, was created by a university club for a game competition in 1979. And again, some obscure of the historians of early gaming point out that this game seems to have influenced the entire genre of what we would call platform games. Because although it doesn't occur on a platform, it's actually top-down, and it's a picture of the old capital, Kyoto. That's why it's called Kyoto Alien. The aliens have come. There's one there. And the hero of the game is a Japanese policeman who goes around and all he has as equipment, because I guess Japanese policemen didn't carry guns, his only equipment was to dig holes, grab a shovel, and what he discovered was that if he could get the aliens to fall into the holes, he could bury them and then they would be destroyed, right? And so the whole idea is to avoid the aliens moving, try to isolate one, dig a hole so you have enough time to then refill the hole before he can kind of get out of it. And if you can do that quickly enough, he's killed, right? Well, this game apparently, in its top-down form, inspired the game which had a similar dynamic called Apple Panic, which was on the horizontal, and what you did is you saw the aliens fall this way, and then you actually could see a kind of a graphic representation in a much more intense way of that hole being filled in and the alien expiring or whatever. And so that is considered to be a game that then just kind of kicked off that whole, hey, let's just have people jumping around floors and climbing ladders, and that inspired that genre. But it's considered that it went back to the inspiration because, the person who said, I did Apple Panic, I was working off of this game, this obscure Japanese game, which inspired me to do it, or something like that. And it was a basic game, right? Overlooked. There are lots of other important games, I think. We have 3D person shooters aplenty these days. And although the progenitors of that can be traced back to mini computer systems at universities and institutions that had graphic capabilities like the Plato system and so forth. And some of the first versions of that were done, some kind of pseudo three-dimensional movement through a space, usually a maze of some sort or another to battle something or whatever. But for most people, most young people getting involved in the computer revolution, their first exposure to that would not be from a university system. It would probably be from a basic game, something like this on the VIC-20 here, Rat Run, made by Natovich, C.T. Natovich in 1979. And that would be maybe for the vast majority of people who would eventually get into computing programming in a big way, what would be their primary kind of influence and inspiration about, can I build a 3D world, right? Might have been something like that. And I was certainly inspired by that when I was a young kid. And there's my variation on a algorithm like Natovich's to create a game I called Big Red, where you had to go into a maze in that was 3D portrayed, not my code that did that, but I added a giant killer tomato that you could see moving down the hallways towards you, of course, and then getting at you. It's something like the classic on the ZX81 called where the T-Rex comes and gets you, was what I was trying to recreate with that. One of the games from my original programming experience. Of course, the genre of 3D gaming, very important part of gaming these days. Another obscure game I came across that that was apparently started as a basic program, of which we don't have the original anymore. And so this is one of those losses, is the game Empire, which was attributed as a foundational game in the whole genre of turn-based strategy, historical, and simulation games, where you try to navigate a kind of a 3D, a two-dimensional world map and so forth. And the key feature that was kind of piloted in this early basic program by Bright was that idea of the fog of war view, where as you move around, you only see the immediate area around you appear. And areas outside of that are dark. So you don't know what the terrain is, where the lakes and the rivers are and the blockages will be, or more to the point, where the enemy player is, who you're playing against, who is also moving around their landscape and planting bases and placing units, and eventually you will then begin to interact. But you have limits to, as each player, what you can see immediately that is based on what you have been able to explore so far and so forth. So that dynamic, as I said, was piloted in that Walter Bright game, and apparently the first version of it he created as a high school student, simply using BASIC in some form or another, and then he eventually went on and reprogrammed it in Fortran, and then that version got spread through the internet, the early intranets, and it became an inspiration for this kind of dynamic of the fog of war, world exploring, world conquering kind of genre. So that's a sad loss, I think. Another game which people might not be aware of that has basic origins is Sokoban, one of the first kind of action puzzle games. That's a kind of an important genre because we love our puzzles and we love our action. And I watched at least 3 people playing kind of action puzzle games on the plane flight here from Nova Scotia in the seats in front of me, all moving blocks or whatever it is they're doing, kind of games like that. They're puzzles, but they're more dynamic. They require they have elements of reaction time built into them as well. An important genre. But one of the first games that kind of kicked off that whole phenomenon was Sokoban, which is literally a Japanese term that means warehouse worker or something like that, who's moving boxes around a space, trying to unavoidably, not push them into positions where he can't move them any longer, to try to move them from one place to another through a complex maze system. But apparently that game began in BASIC, but once again, I don't think the original version exists anymore. The game was eventually sold to corporate people who then commercialized it in some kind of machine language form, and it became a major hit of some sort or another. And the kind of role that BASIC had played in starting it, of course, then was obscured and lost. Another thing that might have escaped people was that Elon Musk got his started in BASIC, right? And this is another game that I've managed to port to the MC10. So me and Elon are friends now, hopefully. I don't know what he would think of my variation of it for this terrible, obscure little computer, but he's got one. Maybe he'll send some money my way someday. I don't know. There's my version over there on the right. But there's the original source code. And once again, when I first came across this notion that he had been a basic computer programmer, I couldn't find a working version of it on the net, and I had to create my own so that I could put it up and share it with people and so forth. And I did that, and now there are other people who've converted it into modern languages and allow you to play it as a net game and so forth and so forth. But I think it's important to kind of capture the dynamic of the original program to try to get a sense of what his programming influences were. So what I'm fighting against here is what some people call the potential for a digital dark age. That is to kind of lose a record of these early kinds of intangible items like basic computer programs, which can then end up being trapped, only not in playable form, as listings in books or in magazines or on obscure printouts and so forth, and not able to be interacted with people, to be able to try to find some of the details of the insights of their development and their influence and how they work. I mean, part of that is, the famous programmer Dijkstra's remark, that BASIC just ruins programmers and is a horrible thing. Sorry, it's going too fast for me here. Another part of it is, I think, simply that kind of tendency for corporate capture of history because of its outsized influence in terms of popularizing games and spreading them around. So why I want to explore the Canadian angle here is that are there insights to be discovered like those that I've mentioned here today in that field? Who are our major contributors to early basic computer use, and what contributions might have they made? But before I can get to that, I have to try to get my hands on the materials. So in part what I'm here to do is kind of an exercise into advocating for that, but also hopefully recruiting some of you to help contribute to this effort that I'm making, because some of my earliest efforts amongst popular forums to kind of say, hey, do people know of major Canadian computer programs? Largely went over like a lead balloon. And a few people said, oh, well, I've heard of a few, but not many. And the reasons for that are that they're somewhat obscure, obscured by our North American situation. And so I think we want to avoid the possibility of losing more originals and not having them available. We've possibly lost some of these ones here. VisiCalc, that monumental program, started out as a testbed program, at least, written in BASIC, to kind of try to get some of the basics of the interaction that the designers of that system of simply, inputting numbers in tables and so forth, and would it work? To kind of try that idea out, they did it in BASIC to see what it would be like to try to interact on a computer screen, putting numbers into tables and then having the mathematical work that you want done on it. And that facilitated them kind of saying, yeah, this could work. And then they, of course, made it into a commercial program in machine language. But do we have that early test bed? No, it's gone now, I think. So I've recreated it, reprogrammed it, what it might have been like. Bomberman, a game that was considered kind of influential in regard to the dynamic of tempting your opponents into a zone, leaving a bomb for them, and then running away before it explodes so that it takes them out. That genre seems to have started with maybe that early BASIC program it was compiled BASIC and it was meant as a demo. But again, that original is gone now. A commercial game was eventually made into machine language, and that became the one of kind of record. But the original is gone. And as I said, Lode Runner has disappeared. So we want to avoid that kind of possibilities. And there are some holes, I think, from my first kind of work through of the Canadian genre. I've come across a game for the PET that you can see in the upper left there called MicroGo 9L, apparently written in BASIC, with a magazine review article of it saying, hey, Go is a really hard AI kind of task to try to recreate a game of, and this person's done it in BASIC. This Canadian company, this little company, has created this wonderful version of Go that actually plays a half-decent game. But can I find it? No, it's gone, it seems. And that might be a kind of a very interesting little piece of early AI computing, but that BASIC played a role in and Canadians played a role in. But as far as I can tell, it seems to be gone from the repositories for PET programs that at least I can gain access to. So that's a hole. If anyone can fill it, please tell me. Another hole I have is, of course, I'm not really a good French speaker. And I was trying to start, trying to trace down Quebecois early BASIC programming. And I have very limited success. Only a few programs from an Atari database that seem to have been written in French and in BASIC, but nothing else major. But I had started to pore through the archives of the Bibliothèque Nationale using my standard search methods and came across references to a bunch of text adventures that had some connection with the humor magazine Croc as such, that it seemed to be kind of promoting or contributing to in terms of the ideas that were a part of the game. And so I was trying to chase those down and get hold of those games. I think what I've finally discerned is that they were actually machine language and produced by a commercial company of some sort or another, and didn't turn out to be basic games as I had hoped. Again, those kind of speak to my own limited abilities, and I just beseech people. Those are the obstacles that I'm facing, right? The other obstacle is that, I try to keep a record of these things on the internet, and I have to worry about copyright, right? Do the owners of these original programs appreciate somebody coming along and then modifying or porting or sharing their source code? Now, it's normally as basic, especially if it's a type-in, been kind of published already, and all I'm doing is retyping it, but now I'm sharing it. But I'm not selling it, so there's a lot of gray zone here about doing that. And so I've had to try to reconsider how I'm going to share these and try to preserve these findings that I've had, and have come to the conclusion that the legitimate way to do that, of course, is to hand it over to a museum who will then keep it in a locked filing cabinet until sometime after 2050 when the numbers are done. And then they'll be able to share these things appropriately and freely as publicly available materials. It's probably even longer than that now. We keep extending the dates on those kinds of things. But that can be a bit worrying for people who are engaged in these kind of preservationist exercises like I am, because if my heart goes, my wife will be dumping my stuff and all of my materials and my computers and all of my media and so forth like that, and that will be gone. So unless it's being held by somebody who's got a little bit more longevity than that, then it's gone, right? Yeah. And the obstacles that I've had to overcome are pretty obvious. Canadians kind of work in the North American publishing market. So when my major sources type in books and type in magazines, they don't always clearly identify the nationality of authors, especially in magazines, especially if they're like staff writers who are contributing programs of some sort or another. I'm searching the searchable databases now of scanned copies of magazines primarily that have some kind of text recognition. I'm using the basic technique of looking for the words go to and go sub, which are unique to the basic language in a certain sense, or at least to programming languages, not English in general, so that it differentiates where I might find code. And then I'm looking for adding some variation for Canada or Canadian as such. And that brings me to code that I can find. But it doesn't necessarily bring me directly to code that's written by Canadians. I have to search through them painstakingly, the magazines, and see if it's referring to a Canadian author, and then if there's some reference to their address or something like that. But if they're staff authors, that's usually just left in the background. So something like the contributions to Softside, a major magazine in the early 80s, of Morris and Cope here. I just happened to stumble across some kind of American editorial reference to, and our friends who are up there freezing in the horrors of the wild north or something like that, which we can all be sympathetic with today, I guess. Some kind of, snippy little American comment about our weather in regard to these two folks and them being Canadian, deserving of our sympathy for that. And all of a sudden I realized, hey, these guys are major contributors to that magazine, and they've got a lot of programs in there, and they seem to be Canucks. So go and find their books and their magazines. And I was able to get some programs that way. But for other staff writers, it's just incredibly difficult to discern those kinds of things. So there's some references there. The other major obstacle I have is, that perennial one, CanCon. How do you define something as Canadian, right? Is it just authors that I'm looking for? Or what about Canadian magazines? There were a few computing magazines, like these ones here, Computing Now, and so forth, that I've included in my database, but I think the main authors are Canadian, but I can't be 100% sure. But they're Canadian magazines, so I'm going to include the programs that they included as part of my database and so forth. But that's an obscurity. The other problem will be something like a program down in the bottom right here where you have an interesting game called Lines of Action, which is a unique kind of a board game invented by apparently a very obscure Canadian Claude Soucy, who moved to the United States and I guess eventually became an American. But he, had this really strange fascination with board games and created all kinds of them apparently. And that seems to be a particularly Canadian interest. Lots of Canadians play lots of board games, as we all know. It's kind of a unique fascination. And he seems to be representative of that. And so I found a game created by an American author in a Canadian magazine, an Atari magazine, ROM magazine, kind of paying homage to this game. Does that count? And does it properly fit? So dealing with those obscure metaphysical issues about what defines Canadian are kind of also vexing me. So any input people can give me on that question would be much appreciated. Some pitfalls I've had while I've searched for these games are that sometimes you come across programs that look very interesting and all they're doing is they're just starting a machine language program. And then it's kind of like, no, this is not for me. But you spent a lot of time maybe hunting it down and then it turns out to be that. And I've already talked about the crocodile disappointment one. Another thing is that you can find large Canadian historic hobbyist computing groups from the early 1980s, like Logic, the Loyal Order of something I can't remember. It's a largely Apple group. TPUG was, of course, a Toronto Pet Users Group, a major influential group. But they just have large repositories just filled with all kinds of public domain program and commercial programs. And that would require me to actually go in and play those programs and try to figure out if they have splash pages. And that's just a huge monumental exercise, right? Because I'm not that familiar with Commodore machines or with Apple machines. And so those are the kinds of limitations that have prevented me from extending my explorations, which tend to be a little bit TRS-80 focused. And focused on things that I can get hold of, like scans of magazines. So they're type-in focused rather than other ways that people might have distributed basic programs. So that's a kind of a hole that's left as well in my work. Have I made any major discoveries? I've mentioned a few things that are interesting, like the AlphaGo, or like the Go program there that might be missing. Beyond that, I was intrigued to discover, about groups like Speakeasy Software, one of the first software companies in the late 70s who actually tried to make a commercial software go of it. We're one of the first groups to kind of sell their tapes in plastic bags with the mimeographed documentation model, spreading it around, and then later adding by mail and so forth. But some of the earliest computing stores would put their stuff up, and so they were one of the first major commercial companies trying to make a way in the software industry. And had some major games like Wheeler Dealers, which is considered one of the first computer games packaged in a box, for example, and so forth. A kind of a formal move in the development of the computer software industry. Are there any themes? I think there's a highly educational focus to all the materials I've found so far. Like some of the works by those soft side authors that I mentioned are highly educational in their focus. And of course, there was a kind of a resource theme focus, maybe harkening back to the Canadian origin story or something like that. Some of the earliest games attributed to Canadian authors. Hammurabi, a major game of, resource management society kind of a model, and that game wasn't programmed originally in BASIC, but the popular version of it was a translation of it. It was an obscure, trial language that it was programmed for. but the popular version was certainly in BASIC. Fur Trader game, another of the classic 101 BASIC games that were highly influential. Like I said, Bulls and Bears by Speakeasy Software, one of the first commercial offered games sold commercially, but written in BASIC. Hard to get hold of, and so I made a copy of it. Okay, so I think that's it. I'll leave it there. Any questions? Any questions? Sorry. Sure. Sorry, the mic's coming.
There's the microphone. Hi. Hi. Hello. Hi. Oh. Sorry, feedback. I just have a question about Sokoban.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know the contest? You said it was submitted for a contest. Was that to a magazine? Or are you talking about the version that was done at his parents' record store?
I think, I'm not sure about Sokoban.
Oh, because
what contest that one was for.
I'm just wondering if we could find that contest. We could find that lot. You said it was lost. The original version was lost.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe we can work it back to find that contest, find the magazine.
Yeah, I don't think it was a magazine contest. I mean, if I'm thinking of another Japanese game here, I think a lot of the early contests were actually sponsored by some of the first computing companies, and they were just trying to get software created for some of their home systems, right? So they would offer up money and then advertise that with computing clubs, right? Like the ones at the universities and so forth. And then if those games that won the contest were very popular, then other companies would then potentially offer for the rights of that or to distribute that and so forth. But I'm not sure if that one was for a magazine and whether it was ultimately published or not. And so that maybe it's sitting as a type-in a Japanese magazine. I have a son who can read Japanese characters who helps me try to navigate those things. And I have found some of the source code and other things that way. But again, it's a kind of a difficult thing. But do you think you could do it? Or okay, good. Yeah, sorry about that. Any other questions? Yep, down here.
Thank you. First, that was great. Mm-hmm. You said so obviously you started like with sorry, I'm blanking on the name of the computer, but like as a kid with like the
MC10.
MC10.
Precious.
And then you've come back to it as an adult.
Yeah.
Did that time between, did that change anything for like your perspective or nostalgia for the machine? Like what was that like coming back to it as an adult?
Well, I mean, it was part of my midlife crisis, so it was absolutely salvational. Life can get pretty grim in the middle point there, and you need your distractions. So it was certainly very useful to have that and it was a little bit cheaper than, getting a giant red Maserati or something like that. I already own this and it still works, like I said, so I didn't have to expend a huge amount. My wife appreciated that. But did I, if I was to be psychologically honest about it, I was still fighting the battles of the schoolyard is really what I was doing. It's like, if I could only have done this back then, wow, then they wouldn't have made fun of me. all those Commodore and Apple people and Atari people with such better systems and so forth. There's an attempt at lost redemption there, yeah, for sure. I've just revealed too much, I think. Any other questions or follow-up questions? Feel free to follow up if you want. There's one over here.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was curious, do you know why there's many of these early games came from Japan? So is there any reason?
Well, in a certain sense, one thing you discover when you're going back and doing this kind of exercise is that there's a kind of a time differential. Like, obviously, the United States sets the tone, and their revolution is 1977 to 1982, when home computing is really coming into the home for the first time, right? But places like Britain, it's like 1978 to 1975 and so forth. And I think you could say maybe about Japan, it was like 1979, maybe 1980 to 1986 or something like that. And the process is unfolding of home computers and magazines and type-ins and BASIC and so forth. So there's different time lags for all of them. But the Japanese, of course, had a huge electronic industry, but they were somewhat hobbled because they had to build machines that could also handle their character set additions, which adds cost, which I think maybe delayed its advent, the home computing revolution. You can kind of see that, right? Kind of unfolding in this time delay. But they are quite clearly a very well-educated, really tech-oriented society, and they went to town on creating magazines. They just have huge numbers of magazines with endless numbers of type-ins in them, which I've only just dipped my toe into, obviously, as a foreigner. So. They took to computing very early, and I mean, somewhat delayed, but then really got on board.
Thank you.
Yeah. You have to have at least another AK of ROM to put some basic characters of kanji in or whatever. So, yeah, just puts the costs up. Other questions? Okay, well, thank you. And if you have any insights for me, you can look up Type In Mania is kind of the name of my sites, my repositories of code and so forth, and get in contact with me those ways if you have anything to add. I appreciate it. Okay, thank you.